So thank you all for coming out, I have what I hope will be an interesting talk. The title of today's talk is Big Data, What It Is, How It's Used, and Where It's Headed. And I'm going to be very intentional about walking through each of those topics. Some of you in the audience may understand something about these topics. This is pitched at a general audience, so forgive me if I don't go too deep. There is time for Q&A at the end, and I'm happy to go as nerdy as you want to go. Jeannie gave you a brief bio on me and where I came from. I want to dwell on this last bullet, though. You may not know Cloudera. It was the first company in the world focused on big data for the enterprise. Google and Yahoo and Amazon and a few other companies had invented technology for dealing with internet scale data. But all of it was locked up in those consumer internet companies. My co-founders and I in 2008 realized that something really interesting was happening on the web, and that banks and hospitals and insurance companies were going to want some of that magic too. So we adapted a bunch of the research and took advantage of some open source software that the community had produced, and we built a big data platform that was aimed at traditional enterprises. I tell you all of that because since 2008, I've been able to watch what big enterprises do with data when they can wrangle it at scales that were previously absolutely impossible. In order to tell those stories, of course, I got to begin with the rudiments. What the heck is big data? For just about ever, people have been collecting information. When many folks in this room began their careers in, say, the 70s or the 80s, data kind of happened at human scale. You'd hire or fire a person, and you would change a record in your employee database. Or you'd go to the shop and you'd buy a thing, and a transaction record would happen in the sales database. But data didn't get made any faster than people could move, because people were fundamentally the source of that data. What's happened in the decades since is that machines have begun to make data. And that has made it possible to create huge amounts of information. Every engineering talk has to have a chart that goes up and to the right. This is a really wicked up and to the right chart. Okay, so this is a curve that's pretty close to exponential, right? It's not quite doubling annually, but it's growing pretty fast. And if you look over here on this axis, you maybe can't see the numbers, 0, 20, 40, 160. In 2025, that number's about 175. 175 what? 175 zettabytes. Okay, so there's gigabytes. Y'all got gigabytes. You might even, if you're a particularly adventurous consumer, have terabytes. But you know, after terabytes, there's petabytes. And then there's exabytes. And then there's zettabytes. So we're thousands or millions of times bigger than what you have. By the way, after zettabytes comes yottabytes. And you don't gotta watch that curve too long before you know we're gonna need yottabytes. You know what comes after yottabytes? Nothing. We run out of metric system. Seriously, that's a problem. And so, I have a secret campaign, and if you ever have a chance to vote on it, I want the next one to be hellabytes. So you see that come by, I want you to vote for it. Data is growing at an absolutely remarkable pace. The details behind the numbers, this is a survey by an industry research group called International Data Corporation. This is the total volume of storage capacity that is shipped each year. In 2025, IDC says, 175 zettabytes of new storage will leave the factory. So, you know, a bunch of this storage that got shipped back here is already holding data when all of that vast new amounts of data happens. The only reason you would do that is if the planet is making data at an increasing rate. You're going to need to capture and keep that data for longer and longer. That data that explosion of data, I believe, is going to continue. It's broken down here, by the way, and you can't see the colors very well, by where the data is being generated. Those of you who pay attention to geopolitics, hey, you know, those Chinese people, lots of surveillance going on over there. There are all kinds of data collection efforts worldwide, private and public sector, and I'll get into some of that in a little while. But up and to the right, and forecast to continue being resolutely up and to the right for a very long time to come.
There's China, the U.S. What's ROW?
Oh, rest of world. Rest of world. You know, it's like the Philippines and Hawaii and those guys. Yeah. Okay. So why would that be true? Why would we need all of that storage? Well, there's this little thing called the internet. I don't know if you heard of it. More and more devices in the world wake up able to connect to a ubiquitous network. And those devices in general generate data. You can think of lots of kinds of data that get generated. For example, programmed stock trading on Wall Street. That's machines connected to the internet, making things happen, making transactions happen at internet scale. If you've got a Ring doorbell, or an Alexa smart speaker, or a Nest thermostat in your house, you are a source of data on the Internet of Things. You are all carrying around in your pockets these highly sophisticated surveillance devices, right? They can see, they can hear, they know when you're walking, they know which direction you're going, they know where you are, and they're connected to 4 or 5 different radios. These are wicked sources of data, and we're all making that happen. So data is happening because of the sensorization and the instrumentation of absolutely everything. You'll see more and more smart devices want to come into your house. And I'm going to give you some examples later about smart devices in your home that are generating data now. But that, I believe, is an absolutely irrevocable trend. So more and more stuff is going to be smart and connected to the internet and going to be generating data that people want to capture and analyze. The first thing that makes big data happen is that data generated at machine speed, many, many more machines than ever before making that data. All by itself, it's not enough. 2 other trends make big data happen. One is, you saw the 175 zettabyte slide a little minute ago. You know, we can finally afford to store all that stuff. It used to be very expensive to store small amounts of data. And so we had these rigorous practices for getting rid of it as quickly as we could. But now it's cheap enough to buy big disk that we just let it hang around. We can afford to keep data at scales that we never could before. And not just keep it, because if it just lay there on a spinning disk drive doing nothing, it'd have no value. There'd be no reason to waste that money. The other thing that's happening is data centers like this one, cloud computing, are giving us huge amounts of cheap compute to ask questions of that data. When we can store terabytes of data and ask questions of it that run on thousands of computers in parallel at very high speed, we can do analyses that were previously impossible. We can squeeze value out of that data in ways that we never could before. So 3 things make big data happen. First of all, it gets generated. Second of all, we can afford to store it. And third, we can afford to ask questions of that data in ways we never could before. Those 3 trends are just in the last decade or 2. They're fairly new. We're still figuring out how to use data at this scale. We can talk more about that during Q&A if you want to. I struggle with whether to put this chart in or not, but this is for the nerds in the room. This is who's buying the data storage. Back in the day, most of the data storage on the planet belongs to individuals like you and me, right? You might have a phone in your pocket, you might have a PC in your house, but you multiply by the 7 billion or so people on the planet, and a lot of the data belong to consumers. Companies, enterprises had a fair bit as well. These cloud computing vendors, Amazon and Google and Microsoft, you know, back in 2010, they were a de minimis fraction of the total amount of storage on the planet. Look at these curves. By the way, these are just percentages of total data stored, right? So the volume's going up, but right about now, the cloud computing companies have the same amount of storage that consumers do, and that fraction is going to continue to grow. More and more of the share of data is going to move into those big cloud providers. So they're driving economies of scale in ways that the rest of us aren't. Okay, so I told you I had to tell you three things, right? What is big data? And now I've given you a little background. I want to talk about how it's used next. I've got three pieces to this part of the talk. First of all, I have some excellent news for you guys. Big data is fantastic. The world is a way better place than it was before I started Cloudera and we began to solve problems. And I'm going to give you specific examples of ways that this happened. All right, so number one. I got to put on my specs to be able to read my slide notes here. It turns out that white-collar crime pays very, very well. There are $1.75 trillion lost to financial crime every year. Virtually all of that activity is digital. So think of fraud and think of money laundering and think of, theft from people's accounts and so on. All of the data moving around the planet digitally, all of those flows are the targets of bad guys who would like to take some of that money and keep it for themselves. There are lots of, step back. That activity, not just the money moving around, but the activity is also digital. If I trade with someone, both sides of that trade get recorded somewhere. If I'm a banker and I want to collude with my friends to front run a stock on Wall Street, just looking at my trades may not let you understand what's going on there. But if you were able to collect all of the trades by every single bank in North America and put them in one big database, you'd be able to look at patterns of trading among individual traders or in groups of traders. If you could pair that transaction data with recordings of the traders talking to one another on their telephones or messaging systems, the news articles that they read or the documents that they mailed back and forth, you could do some pretty good police work to figure out what's going on. And that is precisely what the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, does. So every bank in North America packages up all of their trades at the end of every day, uploads it to a big FINRA website. FINRA builds a graph, kind of the Facebook friends of friends graph. Who's talking to whom, who's trading with whom, how much money. They look for patterns in that graph. They look for evidence of bad behavior by surveilling the communications of the people involved, and they try to find people who are basically colluding to drive prices in stock. A very good use of big data. That 1.75 trillion is a tax on the economy, essentially. And if we can figure out a way to mitigate that, we'll save a lot of money. We'll make life better. So, finding money laundering, combating fraud, and fighting financial crime in general is a great use case for big data. By the way, the regulatory regime on big banks got a lot worse. I'm sorry. From our point of view, unless you're a banker, got a lot better after the 2008 crash. But now, in order to comply with the regulators, bankers are required to examine, report on, and explore their own data in ways that they never would before. Kind of a good time to be a big data vendor because you sell one system to the regulators who are looking at the banks, and they come to you and the banks themselves want to buy those same systems. So that worked out very well for the vendor. But that is a huge driver of value in big data and one of the main use cases in industry today. I want to talk about a little more heartwarming, a little more relatable example. So, if you get sick and you go to a hospital, you got two problems. You are sick and you are in a hospital. The reason that second part is so bad is hospitals are chock full of sick people. And a lot of them have really bad diseases. There's a pretty common blood disease onset in hospitals called sepsis. It's basically an infection of the blood. Folks who come into hospitals generally have underperforming immune systems anyway. They're immunocompromised in some way. If they're exposed to the pathogens that produce sepsis, they're much more susceptible to have an outbreak. What the medical profession has done, and there's a particular company that manages patient medical records that pioneered this use case, what they've done is collected the electronic medical records for a whole bunch of patients over time. They've combined it with the detailed morbidity and mortality data at hospitals. Morbidity and mortality is the way a hospital says to itself, hey, something bad happened. Somebody got sick, somebody died. Pairing all that data together, they were able to train machine learning models on that data and recognize the properties, the attributes that made a patient likely to have sepsis onset. Who comes to the hospital and is a high risk of getting sepsis? Once you figure that out, you know what? There's a special hand washing station outside that patient's private, not semi-private room. You maybe put them on different antibiotics. They changed the care regime, and no lie, saved hundreds of lives as a result. So that's a pretty good use of data, right? That's a pretty good use of data to drive a very positive outcome. There are many examples like that one in the medical industry. It comes from access to that data in volume of very complex and very diverse data types, and it's a tremendous example of good data use. This one is a little bit more close to home for us in the Bay Area. So if you're a PG&E customer, a few years ago, you got something called a smart meter slapped on the side of your house. It used to be the case that every single month, a meter reader would wheel into your neighborhood, and if that person was not drunk or sloppy or slacking off, they'd take a single meter reading from your meter. So once a month, PG&E would know how much electricity you consumed over the past 30 days. What the smart meter does is 10 times a minute, every 6 seconds, communicates back to intergalactic headquarters of Pacific Gas and Electric your instantaneous meter demand, your instantaneous electricity demand. So they can watch your use of electricity, your specific house, fluctuate over time. They do that for whole neighborhoods. They do that for the entire population that they serve. And they've got an incredibly fine-grained, detailed picture of fluctuating usage over time. That is hugely valuable data. They need to be able to predict consumption well in advance in order to spin up the generating capacity that they're going to need. They want to understand how many electrons they're going to pipe across individual wires and able to be sure that they're balancing the load in the right way. All of that is possible because of big data from your smart meters. When you think about it, once a month to every 6 seconds, I did the math at home, you don't have to, that's a 432,000-fold increase. What used to be 1 meter reading a month is now nearly 500,000 readings from your house every single month, times the number of subscribers. So a vast amount of data used to run a more efficient and cost-effective grid. I got one more example that I think is relatable to a bunch of people. So, man, I love the Google, right? My in-laws, when we go visit them, still sit me down with a paper map and tell me to turn right at the Tasty Freeze. And, and I smile and I nod, but I just get in the car and type in where I'm going and I follow the Google. The mapping is a useful service, but the real-time traffic monitoring, that is just magnificent. We're all data sources for that. So if you use the Waze app on your phone or in your car, you're not just listening to Waze telling you where to turn. You're also telling Waze how fast you're moving and what street you're on and so on. And so that data is collected in real time and aggregated. Do many of you folks have fast track transponders in your car? Yeah, so those are boss, right? You don't got to slow down on the bridge no more. I don't know if you're aware, but those transponders don't just talk to the bridge. There are coils in the road as you drive along. And your location is tracked that way. The reason that makes a difference to you is You know that sign on 80 as you're coming around the bridge and it tells you San Francisco Airport is 24 minutes away? That sign is freakishly extrasensory perception good. I mean, I can't believe how accurate it is. The reason it's so good is it's using the real-time traffic data that's being collected. You didn't know, maybe, that you had volunteered to give that data to the highway system when you bought your transponder, but you get pretty addicted to it. So that kind of big data and real-time big data gets analyzed and is used to give you a much better quality of life. Shorten your commute, give you a better idea when you're going to get home. You can call ahead and apologize to your wife before you get there. So that's all real good. So those are 4 pretty good use cases. They're just a small number of the amazing use cases of big data. And the analytic tools that are used to solve these problems are fascinating on their own. I ain't going to go into all that because I want to be sure that we finish on time. And I got some bad news for you. It's not all sunshine and roses. There are a lot of people who are worried about big data for very good reason. A lot of folks are concerned, for example, about the use of platforms like Facebook and Twitter to create bubbles and influence presidential elections and so on. And I ain't going to talk about none of that. You can ask me about it in Q&A if you want to. I want to talk to you about a different kind of risk. So I posited that all of this data lets you do amazing new things. And if you believe that's true, there's this sort of easy default position. You know what? We just collect everything, right? Keep it forever, right? We don't know what questions we want to ask right now, but later on we might think of one, and if we had the data laying around, it'd be great. By the way, 175 zettabytes of space, it ain't like it's going to cost much. That's a bad idea. Big data is a big target. And thieves are after that data for bad uses. And I want to talk to you about some of those bad cases. There are a whole bunch of bad guys in the world. Some are called script kiddies. They're not very sophisticated. Smash and grab, steal your laptop out of the back of your car. That's cybercrime. But there are some that are a little bit more sophisticated. Individual hackers or criminals, even state and non-state actors, are attacking big data repositories to capture data that is going to be valuable to them. I'm going to give you some examples now. This green box over here, probably you're not nowhere near close enough to see it, but it is standard form 86 provided by the federal government. SF86 is what you fill in if you need to get a security clearance. About 4.5 million government employees, 4.2 million government employees with a security clearance right now today. About 1.3 million more civilian contractors that have security clearances. So, those are 5.5 million folks. That's a lot of people with clearances. Every single one of them had to fill in an SF86, be vetted by the FBI or the NSA or the CIA, depending on who gave them their clearance. And what you put into an SF86 is pretty much everything. Every time you left the country in the last 15 years has to be recorded. All the houses you were in for the last 10 years, friends and relatives, all the jobs that you had. It's no longer true that you can't get a clearance if you smoked weed. Many of you would be glad to know that. The concern that the agencies have aren't that you had some youthful peccadillos or even that you engage in what is currently legal behavior. What they're concerned about is how blackmailable are you. So, if you've done bad things, they just want you to write it down so they know. All right, so everybody who fills an SF86 does that. Those SF86 forms land up in storage owned by a group called the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM. In 2014, thieves, I'm sorry, I got to put I want to get the numbers exactly right here. In 2014, thieves stole OPM data, the detailed records of blackmailable offenses from the OPM for 21.5 million security applications. This is a breach you might not have heard about, but it is a gobsmackingly bad breach. the detailed information about who those folks are, including passport numbers and SSNs. You know, a bunch of them wound up being legit spies working for one of the 3-letter agencies, and they now have cover identities in other countries. And if you had all of that info, you might be able to guess who some of them were. I mean, this was a major, major bad breach. Some family members were also caught up if the agencies decided they wanted information on those folks. And then there was a separate theft at about the same time that netted personal data from 4.2 million current and former federal employees. That wasn't the SF-86 data. That was just employment data and history and salary and so on, including Social Security numbers. So somebody broke into the government and stole this vast trove of highly valuable data. You just got to stop and say, wow, maybe we shouldn't have put that data online. Also, in 2014, this breach actually affected my wife and I. I think, Teresa, this is why you got ID thieved. But names, SSNs, addresses, birth dates, income data for about 80 million Anthem subscribers was also stolen. And that could be used by bad guys for all kinds of stuff, including identity theft. Also in 2014, Marriott Hotels chain collects data on stays. So I check into a hotel, when I checked in, when I checked out, my personal data all gets recorded by the hotels. If you're traveling internationally, the hotels also have to report to the government your passport number. And so, passport numbers were attached to a whole bunch of those stays. That data was stolen. You know, you might say, man, 2014 must have been a really bad year for data theft. Not even close to the top 10, man. But these are 3 pretty egregious thefts, and I think you can understand why we should all be a little bit uncomfortable about it. Here's the punchline. OPM, Anthem, Marriott Hotels were all Chinese government thefts. So stop and think why you might have done that. I know who your spooks are. Got their passport numbers. Got information about their health care and about their income. And I know where they were when they were there and how they moved around. If you wanted to monitor U.S. personnel, U.S. government employees, that would be an absolutely unmatched intelligence asset. So, big data is hugely attractive to a whole bunch of thieves, including some folks that are really serious adversaries of the country. Story ain't over. This guy in the foreground, maybe not too popular in Berkeley this week, right? The Department of Justice announced on Monday that it was charging 4 Chinese military personnel, active duty Chinese military personnel, in absentia, we won't bring them to trial here in the U.S., but 4 of them for the Experian data theft in 2017. So 2014 wasn't some fluke, right? Bad actors, state actors, have been chasing big data and these very sensitive repositories for a very long time. I don't want to go into... So you've also all heard about concerns around Huawei and their networking gear just lately, and the federal government doesn't want Huawei to be... I think you understand all of a sudden why we're pretty sensitive about that. I think you... Check. Did I die? You're on. We have a yellow light burning over there.
Did you get your batteries?
Hang on. Batteries flashing.
Swap out some batteries.
I think Huawei doesn't want you to say this.
You were supposed to use the code word.
pay the blackmail?
Chinese batteries, man. I think you can all understand why we're pretty sensitive about Huawei being baked into the comms infrastructure of the country right now. And hey, by the way, it's not merely governments that are doing this, but critical information is being stolen from businesses in much the same way. Folks want to get in and learn about one another's secrets. I've highlighted a whole bunch of examples here. Every government is involved in activity like this. A whole bunch of bad guys are involved in activity like this. And big data makes these kinds of attacks easier in some ways, right? We're all hardening our defenses against them, but we have very large attack surfaces that can be attacked. I want to tell you a different story, and this one is extremely local. It's not like the questions here are always real simple. Should we keep the data? Should we get rid of it? City of Berkeley right now is reviewing the policy for its automated license plate readers. You guys might not know this, but you know the meter maid cars that drive around? So they've got cameras on the front of them now, and those cameras are connected to computers that automatically read every single license plate they go by. Ain't that hard? The Bay Bridge does that, by the way, when you drive through. It listens to your transponder, but it really knows who you are because of your license plate. That automated license plate reader, ALPR data, is used for a few things, right? One is, want to know if you're a scofflaw. So, do you have 5 or more unpaid tickets? Because if you do, I want to slap a boot on your car. And if we can instantly recognize every single license plate that we go by, then we're going to be able to do that kind of parking enforcement better. There are areas in town where you're only allowed to park for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and then you got to leave, and you can't park there again until the next day. And if you, crafty person that you are, move your car to a new spot, they'd like to be able to detect that and ticket you, right? And so that's legitimate parking enforcement, right? You might not like it, but it's legitimate parking enforcement. Turns out, though, that data is also useful to the cops. So if someone commits a crime, the police would often like to know who was in the neighborhood, right? And so bank robbery happens on Shattuck. For the hour either side of that robbery, let's just sort of take a look who was there, and let's figure out what plates and where they were from, and let's let that be an input into the crime-solving effort. I got nothing against that plan. My problem is with the long-term retention of that data. So here's the problem. If you are, right now, the policy says that data is retained for a year. What that means is that your movements around town are recorded for 1 year long. Your typical patterns of where you hang out and when you go there and what you do, right? That is recorded. Not just that, but the fact that Jeannie and I have been scheming against the man for a long time by meeting in the downtown Pete's, right? Our cars are always near each other at a certain time of day. We can begin to look at patterns of association among people, right? That data is available to the cops, it's available to city employees, and it's available to the vendor that is running those systems for the city. And my problem is, I don't know any of those people, right? One of them might be a stalker, right? Jeannie probably has stalkers. I don't have it. That data can also be used to crush dissent and to stop people from their right of free association. And that data is subject to theft by outsiders, right? So the Chinese example that I just gave you, somebody clever that breaks into the vendor system can steal all that data. My point of view, and council members Kate Harrison and Sophie Hahn are working on this along with some input from the ACLU. My point of view is we ought to keep that data because it's useful for what it does, but only for as long as we need it. And there's no way you need that data for more than a week. You're going to notice before the week is out that the bank got robbed, right? And you don't need the parking data more than the day you collected it on. So I hope that we'll be successful in imposing a policy that deletes that data on a sort of rolling 7-day track, simply because if it ain't there, it can't be stolen. And that's a really essential way to protect big data. I promised you that I wasn't going to talk about Facebook and a bunch of other stuff. If you've enjoyed a horror story or two that you've heard, you can take oh wow, it really doesn't read well. You can either take a picture of this slide, or we'll put them up on the Skeptic site. There are a whole bunch of stories that are super interesting about face recognition and its use in law enforcement, about the detailed location data that you are leaking to the mobile carriers all the time, about how the phone manufacturers are able to examine patterns of behavior using applications on your phone and deduce things about you and your activities thereby that you haven't really thought about probably. And this stuff is good to pay attention to. I'm obviously a huge fan of big data, right? It was what I did for years and years. It made my career. I loved the use cases in healthcare and in finance and in energy and elsewhere that I got to talk to you about. But this stuff is fraud. So where is this going to head? What's coming up? Remember the up and to the right chart, right? So my point of view is this is a law of nature. We're just going to keep getting more data. There ain't no way off that treadmill. So we should expect that more data is going to be collected and used in more ways. And we ought to think as a society what we want to have happen. We have begun to do that. There are now some useful laws about data that didn't exist a while ago. In the United States, for decades, we had precisely two nationwide laws about data privacy. One is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, and it provides pretty strict controls on what can happen with your medical data. And the other is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and that's a very tiny slice of law that controlled what could happen with your consumer banking data. But that was it, man. Any other data collected by any other party for any other purpose was fair game for almost any purpose. That was kind of a worldwide circumstance, but the European Union in the middle of 2018 passed a law called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. When I was a vendor, I thought it was a little bit of a crappy law. But on balance, even then I thought it took the right perspective, philosophy. It privileges citizens and individuals and says you should have control over your data. You ought to know what's being collected. You ought to be able to correct stuff that is wrong. And the GDPR introduced a notion that was pretty radical at the time. You ought to have the right to demand its deletion. You should have the right to be forgotten, right? You should be able to go to any company that's got data on you, and as long as there's not a legal requirement like banking information that has to be kept, you ought to be able to demand its deletion. GDPR got passed into law. The penalties for violating GDPR are onerous. I think the numbers are $40 million or 4% of your gross income for the year for each violation. So basically, that's a go out of business fast command, right? And scare the bejabbers out of every single business. Anybody doing business in Europe, interfacing with European citizens, is required to comply. By the way, a whole bunch of U.S. companies are in that group, and therefore are required to comply. And they have to comply whether the GDPR, whether the European citizen is in Europe at the time or is in the U.S. at the time. So you stop and think about it. The safe move is just to apply the GDPR to every piece of data you collect, because you for sure don't want to be spending $40 million or 4% of your GDP, whichever is greater, right? So GDPR was really a law that forced companies globally to take data privacy seriously. January 1st of this year, the California Consumer Protection Act went into effect. And it's patterned pretty well on GDPR. A lot of the same concepts about data ownership and right to be forgotten and right to correct the data all apply. The penalty regime is a little bit different, so don't fret about that. But California has passed such a law, and now other jurisdictions, and in particular blue jurisdictions, are looking at copying it. I'm kind of against that plan. My worry, and I'm not a businessman anymore, but when I was a businessman, my worry is if Maryland and California pass very slightly different laws, how am I going to resolve that? How do I know who's a Maryland resident and who's a California resident when they're driving cross country? I think it'd be a lot better if there were a single nationwide law. For sure, under the current White House, that's not going to happen. And passing that law may not be a priority for the next administration. In the meantime, I suspect a lot of companies in the U.S. are just going to adopt the requirements of the California law because nobody is likely to be, it's likely to be representative and strong enough. So, but I would like there to be a single nationwide law. And I actually despaired of any U.S. Law on this for a long time. But finally in 2020, the California one went into effect. I want to close with just a few other thoughts. So what should you do personally? Every time I download an Apple software update, I get presented with 40 pages of legalese. And I always click through. And I bet you cash money that Tim Cook owns my house right now in Apple. Right? You really ought to read them, guys. And especially the stuff about what data they collect and what they do with it. Under Ccpa, they have to be clearer about that. They have to tell you what information and who they'll share it with. And you should read that stuff, and you should try to understand it. Understand not just what data they're collecting, but how they're going to use it. A lot of times they're allowed to share it with third parties for unspecified purposes, and that's really no restriction at all. So the more closely you understand how they will share your data and what analyses they will do, the better. It'd be best if they deleted it when they no longer need it. I don't think we'll see that move in from industry until consumers push a little bit harder. And whenever you have a chance to do it, whenever you talk to a vendor, you should insist that they follow those guidelines. I've reached the end of my prepared remarks. It is time for Q&A if we want to do that. And I guess, Jean, you walked on my phone around, is that right?
Well,
Thank you.
normally I would walk about with a handheld mic while our speaker would have the headset and everybody would hear everybody, but that ain't going to happen because we had one failure already tonight.
If you
So
shout
I'm
your
gonna
question, maybe I can repeat it.
I'm going to ask Mike to call on people for questions, and please speak very loudly so everyone can hear you.
Back there, yeah. Hand up.
Isn't it true that data is never really deleted? It's always still there and can be retrieved?
Is it true that data is never deleted and can be retrieved? Leaving aside some sort of deep spook stories, no, that's not true. It is possible to delete data, but the people who control that data have to take it seriously, right? You know, backups and duplicate copies may be lying around. Under Gdpr, when they say you have a right to be forgotten, they're not messing around. If there are other copies of the data, that's a violation that leads to those penalties that I talked about. So folks have figured out absolutely how to make that happen. And under these new legal frameworks, I'm confident that companies will follow those laws only because the penalties are so onerous.
How does anybody know? How does anybody know if those backups and all that stuff has been deleted?
How does anybody know if their backups and stuff has been deleted? The answer is, under the terms of GDPR and CCPA, the company is required to basically assert that they have done that. And if they are ever found to have violated that, they're subject to the penalties. And they're scared witless of the penalties, and so you can trust them to avoid the deep financial pain that they would otherwise feel. Yes?
Is there a way to simplify the disclosure requirements? Because like you said, you go on your iPhone, there's an update, you can't read it. I go to the doctor, they hand me 15 pages of paper that I just throw away. That's a burden on the businesses, and it provides no value to the consumer. Maybe they could boil it down to 20 points that
Yes.
they could understand, and then it would have some value to us. be less onerous to the businesses?
Yeah, it's a good question. So isn't there some way that companies could be much more clearer and speak more simply about the data they're collecting, what they're doing with it? No question there is. In May of 2018, and during the month of May, before the law came into effect, I don't know if any of you guys interface with European companies, but I got like mail bombed by companies. We're implementing a new security policy, and the language in those was still a little mealy-mouthed, but much better than it had been in the past. And I suspect if my dream is true, and if we can get people to begin to pay attention to this stuff, the pressure will be to get clear language about how it's used. Still too hard to understand. And I'll be honest, dude, I'm on Facebook all the time. So I tell you how seriously I take security, but I still love all the convenience and stuff. I'm not a perfect example of this, but for a bunch of vendors that I use, I do pay attention to that data. I hope they'll make that easier to understand over time. I thought I saw somebody back there. No? Doug.
So I read that disclosure, and I don't agree with it. My choice is to...
Yeah, so if you read that disclosure and you don't agree with it, it turns out it's not a negotiated agreement. Your choice is not to use the service. And that's kind of a sucky choice. The intent of the CCPA is to enforce better behavior among the vendors. That is, require them to be very clear and put constraints on how they use the data, compensate for you for use of the data in certain cases, but you don't get to go haggle with Apple every time you download a software update. Over time, if we are lucky and diligent, we should see more consumer-friendly terms and behavior begin to take hold. And that's exactly what GDPR and CCPA have already driven. I mean, right now it's way better than it was in 2017. Yes.
So Monday, I got a email from First Republic Bank, and it was encrypted. And I didn't, when I tried to click on it, it told me I didn't have the software to read it.
Yeah.
So what happens? Why? What's the point?
All right, so the question is, on Monday, I got an email from First Republic Bank, and it claimed to be encrypted, and I tried to open the attachment, and it told me I didn't have the software. What the heck is that all about? First of all, please God, don't click on those attachments. That's a very common scam to get software installed on your computer. If you're not absolutely sure that you know who sent the email and why, give them a call. Find out. It's a very common attempt to get it. And actually, Teresa and I had a couple come into our mailboxes that looked super legit from Apple, and that were scams likewise. But that is a different problem from the big data thing that I'm talking about, when someone collects data about you and finds out about you. Actually, what you're talking about isn't entirely separate. If they're successful in stealing your username and password, then they can log into your systems and collect a whole bunch of data about you, which they'll then sell to the bad guys. So in general, practice good email hygiene. Don't click on attachments. Don't look at emails where you're not absolutely sure who sent it to you. How are we doing on time?
A couple more minutes.
Okay, I'm told there's a couple more. Yes.
So you've got the good and you talked about the bad. Like the bad sounds really bad and scary, but like for a normal person, what do we need to be worried about? Like we're not working for the CIA and kind of like.
Yeah, so it's actually a good question. So I gave examples that are pretty dire for folks who happen to be walking around the Beltway with security clearances. But most of us in Berkeley doesn't apply to us. I wanted you to be aware of how sophisticated these thieves are. Your bank and your phone company and your mortgage provider and lots of organizations have lots of information about you. And not just about you, but about everybody else that they do business with. And those folks, all of that data is an attractive target for thieves as well. You should be aware of that. because it should make you ask your bank and your mobile provider and so on what they're collecting and why, right? And they should be able to give you the answers to those questions. My goal is you walk out of here not freaked out, but with a new appreciation that, you know, data about you is out there, and the less data about you that is left lying around, the less likely that it will be stolen. So I think that that is the direction that these new laws and some of the social trends are moving. And it's important for all of us to be aware of that, to encourage it to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not really concerned that my credit card company, my bank, my mortgage company, my stockbroker has all this data because they don't really have any ill intentions toward me. Maybe it helps them serve me better, but don't they then also make a revenue stream out of that by selling it to brokers?
Yes.
Who then may sell to other people that may have bad intentions to me, and that I have no control. I don't know these people now. I have no business relationship with them. They have all this data.
Rich source of revenue in the data industry is selling the data you collect to third parties. And in fact, companies who make a significant amount of money doing that, selling data about you, are treated specially in Ccpa. There are special terms that apply to them. That is one of the two issues. So folks collect data about you, and if their policy says, and we will sell it to third parties, you should be worried about that. You should yell at your bank about that, and maybe even think about changing banks. At least threaten to change banks because of that. But it's not just if they sell it. It's also if they didn't install the latest Linux patch and someone breaks into their system and steals that data. That is, from your point of view, indistinguishable from them having sold it. Some third party has it and it's out there and you don't know where it went, but you'd be pretty sure you've lost control of it, right? So those two things are the concern, right? Data about you that is stolen, data about you that is sold, from my point of view, those two are isomorphic. Do I have time for four more?
I think you have one more.
Anybody besides Doug, because he just won't shut up. In the back, with the lovely hat.
How do we find out how much of the data that government has collected has been sunsetted?
How do we find out how much of the data that government has collected has been destroyed? Well, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I kind of should. There are retention policies in the agencies, but I don't have a good picture, even at the federal level, of in the aggregate, how is that data treated? It's a good question. I bet it's really hard to figure that out. And on that cheerful note, I'm going to give the microphone back to Jeannie. Thank you guys for your attention.
If I may remind you, next month's speaker will be Sarah El Shafi. She'll be talking about why storytelling is important to science communication. If you are interested in the subject of tonight's talk, you might like to join us again in April, where we will have a speaker talking about not big data, but applications of data that we would perhaps find objectionable. So watch your email from Bay Area Skeptics for an announcement of next month's and the following month's talks. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.